Hey, what's going on, y'all? This is Aaron Burr of the Free Thought Doctrine. I have another quick episode I want to do right now. This is based off an article I saw just here recently, and I felt like I needed to do a podcast about this one. It's an article from the Washington Post. It was written this morning by a guy named Jason M. Blazakis, and it's an opinion piece. The title is, "It's a Real Possibility That Our Next 9/11 Could Arrive From Within." So, again, the Washington Post, which I affectionately call the Washington Compost, because, you know, they're fucking trash. But with that being said, I do want to go over this article because this fits the same narrative that they've been trying to push since January-ish, right? About, you know, the right wing in this country being the next threat, if you will. Essentially, you know, it's right-wing extremists we need to worry about. And so anyways, let me go into this article. It begins, "For many Americans, the first searing image of terrorism was not of jets plunging into Manhattan skyscrapers or a smoldering Pentagon, but of a heroic firefighter cradling soot-covered, lifeless infant in Oklahoma City. Two white men, both Americans, had blown up a federal office building. Domestic terrorism, fueled by government-hating extremists, awakened the nation in April 1995. And as the United States prepares to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we must confront the real possibility that our next 9/11 could arrive from within. We must resist the urge to see the horrific suicide attacks in Afghanistan in August and the apparent reemergence of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda as a reason to return to dated strategies and tactics. As someone who has worked on national security issues in the U.S. government for more than a decade, I've concluded that the U.S. war on terror launched in the wake of 9/11 has left us unprepared for the domestic threat that grows by the day. Complicating matters further is that in today's politically charged environment, the Biden administration will find it difficult to pivot toward the domestic threat. But we must move beyond the narrow obsession with international terror and mitigate the extremist threat at home. Here are 5 ways to do so." All right, so first of all, just take note that first he brings up images of the Oklahoma City bombing, which, if anybody is old enough to remember, was a pretty horrific event. Mainly the childcare being blown up. And, I mean, there's all kinds of different narratives that go along with that one. But then he goes into talking about, you know, right-wing extremists. And, well, let me go on. Let's see. He lists 5 things. Fund and expand FBI capabilities. Yeah, because the FBI is just this great organization, right? Until recently, the vast majority of FBI resources were devoted to tracking individuals tied to groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Well, he's kind of leaving out, you know, their complete dedication to catching all the January 6 people. But anyways, going on. While this is changing, the FBI's resources are not yet aligned to the rising tide of domestic right-wing extremism. In 2019 congressional testimony, Michael McGarity, then assistant of the FBI's counterterrorism division, said 20% of the Bureau's counterterrorism agents worked on domestic terrorism, with the rest devoted to international terrorism. Even though he noted domestic terrorists carried out more attacks and killed more Americans than international terrorists. Like I brought up before, the San Bernardino shooter, the Fort Hood shooter, the Orlando shooter, the Boston City Marathon bombers. So I'll give you that one. More agents devoted to investigating domestic extremists would be an important first step in understanding and combating the threat before us. Next, update the domestic terrorism statute. Oh my gosh, not one January 6 insurrectionist has been charged with terrorism. And even white supremacist Dylan Roof's murder of 9 black parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 didn't merit the charge in the view of prosecutors. Even the laws enacted after the Oklahoma City bombing have been used to target international terrorism, but not neo-Nazi groups or other domestic threats. A stronger terrorism statute would, in many cases, pave the way for longer prison sentences and provide clearer paths to prosecution of accomplices without violating constitutional concerns. Okay, so stronger terrorism statutes. That's what we need. More laws. And without violating constitutional concerns. Yeah, sure. Next, treat the far-right challenge as a transnational issue. The U.S. intelligence community should adjust its collection priorities to better measure the overseas far-right threat posed by neo-Nazis and like-minded groups. After the 9/11 attacks, our intelligence agencies focused on groups such as Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and their affiliates. We must continue to do so, but also augment U.S. foreign intelligence capabilities against international neo-Nazis and other extremist groups that communicate with, share propaganda with, and sometimes financially support far-right groups here at home. Well, I want to see the receipts on that one, because most of those neo-Nazis, quote-unquote, they're big in their own countries because they have massive migrant issues and all the stuff that goes along with that. So I don't really see why they give 2 fucks about what's going on over here. But so I'd have to see the receipts on that one. Going on. Take the fight to social platforms. Here we go. It's big tech censorship. From fundraising to operational planning to propaganda, social media sites are the unseen back offices of modern terrorism. Social media companies are big on self-policing, implementing their own usage policies and removing content. That violates their standards, but their efforts are no match to the sophisticated and nimble work of bad actors. The U.S. government could sanction overseas far-right groups, essentially name them as terrorist entities, as an impetus for domestic social media platforms to shut down these groups' access. This approach would aim to keep international terror groups from metastasizing in the United States. So, once again, big tech censorship for, quote-unquote overseas far-right groups. But, saying that you don't believe in vaccine mandates, that could be considered a, far-right position or something like that. Moving on, enlist non-government help. Finally, the U.S. government needs to encourage and fund private sector and nonprofit programs that can help stunt extremism, because federal authorities are not viewed as honest brokers in this fight. We must enlist non-government groups that have experience at uncoupling individuals from extremism and that work side by side with local leaders to identify at-risk populations and individuals. This effort should be part of the U.S. long game, and one devised to ensure that our liberties, human rights, and privacy are not trampled upon in the name of fighting domestic terrorism. An aggressive and intrusive use of federal authority is a real threat too. Well, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. America's radical right extremists and Afghanistan's Taliban might seem like polar opposites, but their approach to financing, recruiting, propagandizing, and fighting are surprisingly similar. The connective tissue is a desire to crush the system, whether the U.S. government or the general world order. By and large, America's domestic threats have had free reign, but even as we mourn the loss of life last month in Afghanistan, the most insidious threats are often the ones closest to home. Like, where do I even start here? So, this is the same shit that we've been saying this whole time, right? It's the War on Terror 2.0. Instead of the global war on terror, now it's the domestic war on terror, right? So, the irony is, and I mentioned this in my last episode, is that it was the right wing, conservatives, being led by neocons and like the Bushes, who built up and created this massive security state, right? This massive national security state apparatus to go after quote unquote terrorists. And just the biggest irony is that now that, you know, like you have like Afghanistan, which is basically winding down, and there's the terrorist threat, if you will, is not what it once was. So now that same apparatus, that same machine, that same war machine, the same surveillance machine is still there. It's still being employed, right? And they still need a mission. So they're just simply turning around their guns. They're aiming, instead of aiming their guns overseas, now they're aiming it at within. And it's as simple as difference in opinion or political opposition. Now they can be easily painted as targets, as is what's happening, right? So the irony is that same apparatus that the right and the conservatives built is literally now being turned against them. Because this is what happens when the government sets a precedent, right? It can always be used against you later on down the road, right? This is the problem in this country in the first place, where you essentially have two factions trying to always take control of the levers of power, and whoever has the levers of power tries to punish their enemies. And the fact of the matter is, the left right now have access to the levers of power, and they're much more aggressive at using that apparatus against their opposition, the right, the Republicans, the conservatives, all those people who built this machine in the first place. But now it's just the same old fucking story. You just look at history. And what I find even more ironic is the fact that, they're calling out this threat of domestic right-wing terrorists. And I'm not saying there aren't neo-Nazi groups out there, or, white supremacist groups out there, or, right-wing militias out there, or whatever. I'm not denying any of that. But what I am saying is, let's look at the real threat, though, right? If you really wanted to look at it that way, what happened last summer? What was on the fucking news every goddamn night? It was left-wing extremists, was it not? Antifa, the Black Bloc, certain elements of BLM, and all the rioters, the ANCOMs, right? That's a narco-communists that were made up a lot of Antifa, and all the buildings. It was like, what was it, like $6 billion worth of property damage? And how many lives were taken? At least 30, 40, maybe more. I mean, I might be way undershooting that. Both numbers, actually. And yet the threat is right-wing extremists. And their only example they have of recent times is January 6th, which was a huge joke, right? If anything, a bunch of fools that enabled this system and situation to come to be in these most recent times. So it's just complete irony. It's the system the right built. They set these precedents. I mean, both sides do it. They set these precedents, and then once the other side takes over, they use that against the other. And the left is always way more aggressive than the right when it comes to this shit. So they just don't get it. I mean, even take, for example, this very latest incident in Florida, right, with Ron DeSantis, and essentially banning and punishing businesses that require, or at least want to require, vaccine passports. Now, of course I'm against vaccine passports. Of course I'm against mandates of any kind whatsoever, because a mandate means that it's enforced by the barrel of a gun, period. So I'm against that, period, right? No matter what. And as hilarious as it does sound, or as hilarious as it sounds, that you have DeSantis passing whatever. I don't know if it's a law, because I could have ordered. I got to look closer into it. but something that not only bans businesses from doing that, but then fines them, and it was some crazy fee, like $5,000 or $6,000 or some shit like that. As much as I find that amusing, the fact of the matter is you're still using state power to run private businesses. And I'm just against that. I mean, that is literally fascism. That's the real world. That's a real example of fascism, right? I mean, it's been going on both ways with all the COVID regime bullshit, right? Those all hardcore examples of fascism, but this is included. And while I have to give DeSantis credit for being anti-lockdown and all that stuff, this is still the wrong move, because once again, he set a precedent, or he continued along the lines of these precedents of being able to tell businesses what to do. And you know what happens when someone on the other side is in charge, and now they could just point at DeSantis and be like, well, he did that, now I'm going to do this, whatever it may be. But it's always seems to be one trend, right? It's always on the side of authoritarianism. It's never on the side of liberty or freedom. And so anyways, 3 points. One, that, here we go again with this narrative from the cathedral about right-wing extremists, right? And now we're turning the war on terror inward, right? So there's that point. And the second point is, who even built that apparatus in the first place? The right wing, the conservatives. And so just the irony that now that apparatus they built, they're the ones responsible for the bullshit at TSA at the airport, right? And everything else, the Patriot Act, warrantless spying, black sites, rendition, Guantanamo Bay, all that shit, right? They're the ones responsible for that. And now they're the targets of that exact same machine. So that's point number 2. And then point number 3 is, it's these precedents, like them setting that precedent in the early 2000s, which now established the same kind of thing to come after them, is the exact kind of shit that's going on with these vaccine passport bans, right? I might get it if you're talking about state localities and shit, but when you're talking about private businesses, and to be fair, DeSantis gets the most press about it, but there's 15 states, all red states, doing the same thing. And again, you might sit there and be like, oh, okay, well, that's fine because I totally stand against vaccine passports. Of course I do. Libertarians definitely do. But again, you leveraging state power to do so, that's just simply punishing your enemies. And the precedent's been set, and they'll do the exact same shit when they're in the position to do so. And this really leads me into a fourth point that I'm just coming up with now, but it's the fact that as much as I do not believe that voting really matters, and it really doesn't on a presidential level, even a congressional level, right? That shit's broken and lost. But I will say on a local level, and that's where it really matters, localism, federalism, right? You have the power to determine your amount of freedom in your state, I guess, to put it that way, right? Because it was certain states like Florida, Texas, Georgia, where if you lived there a year and a half ago, you were more than likely a free citizen compared to people in states like California, New York, et cetera, right? Like, it really did make a difference. The people closest to you can make the biggest difference in your lives, not necessarily the people all the way in fucking DC, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. Whether it's, for the cause of freedom, but more than likely for the cause of authoritarianism and fascism. So with that being said, my closing point is reiterating that fourth point, that voting in using the government as self-defense is probably the only reason that voting is important on the local level, right? Because you can at least vote for people that will shrink the power of the government, decentralize, and basically put in a system to prevent them from passing laws, or at least to inhibit more laws from being passed. The next leadership gets elected, right? So there's always that defensive voting. And you know what? I have my apologies. I got to throw in a fifth point, actually, because the whole point of this article this dude wrote, what at the end of the day, what was it really about? It's more fear, fear, fear. Be scared, be scared, be scared. There's always a boogeyman. There's always a monster. There's always a security threat that requires us to give up even more liberty, more freedoms, and also privileges as well, right? They always want to restrict. They always want to rule with an iron fist, and they will use fear, as an entire COVID regime has, as an entire war on terror has. It's always fear, fear, fear. Fear porn, fear propaganda. That is the way of the state. So with that being said, please check out my Twitter at Aaron Burr FTD, and this is the Free Thought Doctrine.